They always told me family was everything. They said it as if it were a law etched into the bones of our house, one that could never be questioned, only obeyed. And I did. Obey. For 15 years, I obeyed with my wallet, my silence, and the fading outlines of a dream I once had for myself. My name is Elise, and I was born into a home where the definition of love was obedience and sacrifice, but only if you were the right kind of obedient, the kind that kept you in the shadows. My brother, Thomas, could vanish for weeks, return home jobless with excuses like souvenirs, and still be welcomed with open arms. My sister, Nadine, had the soft deflection of the favored, never responsible, never questioned. And me? I was the dependable one. The fixer. The one who showed up. The evening it happened was a Thursday, one of those cold March nights where the air outside is damp and heavy with the scent of thawing regrets. My father had called for a family dinner, the kind that always ended with me footing the bill and someone else taking the credit. But this night, something had shifted. I had planned it all: the roast duck my father liked, the sourdough rolls my sister pretended to make but always bought from the bakery, even the wine chosen to impress the neighbors who might stop by. I set the table with my mother's favorite china, polishing each plate like it was a relic from a life I barely lived. I paid for everything, of course. I always did. Dinner began like they all did, with practice smiles and stories that were less about sharing and more about showcasing. My brother had almost closed a big deal. My sister had maybe found a new agent for her lukewarm art. My father bragged about their accomplishments as if he'd personally carried them there on his back. When he turned to me, the silence was familiar and heavy. But that night, something cracked. Maybe it was the way my mother flinched when my sister spilled wine on the tablecloth. Maybe it was the way my brother laughed when I mentioned a promotion at work and called it adorable. Or maybe it was the fatigue of 15 years of being their invisible backbone finally calcifying into resolve. Then my father slammed his hand on the table. "You're selfish," he barked. "You never sacrifice anything for the family." Nadine nodded like an obedient echo. I remember standing up slowly, not in rage, but with the quiet dignity of someone who has finally understood that silence is not the same as peace. "I brought something," I said. From my bag, I pulled out a manila envelope, thick with folded papers. Receipts. Bills. Transfers. Everything I had paid for since I was 20 years old. My brother's car repairs. My sister's art supplies. My parents' overdue mortgage payments. Vacations I never went on. Dinners I never enjoyed. The braces for a niece I never met. Their whole illusion paid for by me. I placed it on the table. "This," I said softly, "is everything I've given to this family." No one moved. My father's mouth was open, mid-retort, but the words never came. My sister blinked as if she were trying to process a different language. My mother reached out as if to touch the envelope, but didn't. "I'm done," I said. Then I turned and walked out. They didn't believe I'd actually leave. Not until they saw that I had packed up my apartment, canceled the auto transfers, and blocked their numbers. Not until the silence stayed. Not until the credit cards were declined, and no one showed up with a check and a smile. Only then did they scream. But by then, I was long gone. I didn't cry that night. Not on the drive back to my apartment. Not when I passed the diner where we used to celebrate birthdays I always paid for. Not even when I turned the key in the door and walked into a home that had only ever been mine in name. What I felt was something sharper than sorrow and quieter than rage. Relief. It was like breathing after holding it in for too long. I sat on the couch in the half-light, a glass of wine untouched on the table, staring at the silence. No ringing phone. No vibrating texts asking for just one more thing. Just quiet. And in that quiet, memories returned like ghosts. There was the time I missed my college graduation dinner because my father said the restaurant I chose was too expensive, only to take the family out to a steakhouse the next week to celebrate Nadine getting her first internship. Or the time I got pneumonia and still worked overtime to cover the electric bill when Dad's hours were cut, only for them to turn off the heat anyway, not because we couldn't pay, but because Nadine's project needed funding more urgently. And then, last winter, when my mother called sobbing about foreclosure, I'd wired $5,000 within the hour. The house stayed. My name was never mentioned. I had not been a daughter. I had been an insurance policy with legs. I slept deeply that night for the first time in months. The next morning, there were already messages on my work email, my father reaching out through backdoor channels. Your behavior last night was unacceptable. This family has always supported you. You're overreacting. I deleted them without reading to the end. Then came Nadine's voice message. Her tone was soft, almost syrupy. I know you're going through a lot right now. We all say things we don't mean. Let's just move past this. Like it had been a simple squabble. Like the receipts weren't proof of a decade and a half of erasure. I forwarded the voicemail to my archive and went to work. At the office, people noticed something was different. I smiled more easily, breathed more deeply. My assistant even commented, "You look lighter, Elise." Because I was. I'd laid down the weight of them. I changed my number the following week. Closed the joint account I hadn't touched in years, but that they used like an open bar. I notified my HR to block all calls from a list of numbers I provided. Some might call it drastic. But there comes a point when healing can only begin after the infection is cut out clean. Weeks passed. Nadine sent flowers once, with a note written by a florist's assistant. Family is forever, it said. I laughed. Not bitterly, just with the amused disbelief of someone who has seen the puppet strings all her life and suddenly realizes she's not one of the puppets after all. I took a photo of the bouquet and left it at the reception desk for anyone to claim. The next month, I moved. A new apartment, one without the echoes of family dinners turned interrogations. A new number. A new boundary drawn like a line in stone. But even freedom has its shadows. Sometimes, in the soft hours of the night, I miss them. Not the real them, but the version of family I clung to for so long, the one I hoped existed under all the manipulation and conditional love. The version that would hug me just because, ask how I was without needing something in return. That version was never real. Still, I had to mourn her. The girl who believed love could be earned if she just gave enough. Spring arrived with its usual bravado, budding trees, the scent of thawed earth, couples flocking to patio cafes. But for me, it brought something I hadn't known how to name before: space. Not just physical space, though my new apartment was sunlit and quiet, with pale curtains that fluttered gently in the breeze. It was internal space, too. A clearing where obligation used to crowd every inch of my spirit. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up wondering what crisis awaited in my inbox. I didn't check my balance before buying groceries. I didn't rehearse polite ways to say no that would still sound like yes. I simply lived. But healing is not a straight line. It's more like the slow unspooling of a tangled necklace, frustrating, tender, unexpectedly sharp. One morning, I found myself at the farmer's market. I stood by the strawberries, listening to an older couple bicker about which loaf of bread to buy. Their voices were low, amused, easy. The woman laughed and poked her husband's side. He pretended to be scandalized. It was such a simple exchange, but it caught in my throat. That was what I'd always longed for, not perfection, just that kind of comfort, that kind of care. Later, I sat on a park bench nearby and let the tears come. Not because I regretted leaving, but because I finally saw, clearly, just how little I'd ever had. I kept a journal during that season. Nothing elaborate, just a small leather notebook I carried with me. I called it The Cost of Things. On each page, I wrote down something I'd given away. March 2012, paid Nadine's first month's rent in New York so she could start her unpaid art internship. Told everyone I just wanted her to succeed. November 2015, skipped a vacation with friends to send mom and dad on their anniversary trip. They told everyone it was from Thomas. April 2019, wired $10,000 to cover dad's medical bills. He told the nurse his son handled everything. Each entry hurt, but writing them down was like reclaiming a piece of myself. Proof that I had given. that I had loved, that I had shown up even when they hadn't. It also became a reminder that I was no longer that woman. I began to rediscover pieces of myself that had gone quiet. I joined a pottery class on Thursday nights, something I'd always wanted to try. My hands, so used to typing invoices and holding checkbooks, began to learn the shape of creation. And people noticed. Not the family I left behind, but people who mattered. Nora, from the bookstore down the street, who always saved me the latest poetry releases. Andre, my neighbor with the quiet eyes and guitar fingers, who offered to help when he saw me struggling with groceries. Strangers, yes, but kind ones. Honest ones. Without expectations. For my birthday in May, I hosted dinner, not for family, but for the first time, for friends. We sat around a small table in my new living room. Candles flickered. Laughter echoed off the walls like music. I served wine I hadn't bought on discount and used the fancy plates I used to save for visits that never ended in gratitude. When I blew out the candle on my cake, someone asked, "What did you wish for?" I didn't say it out loud, but I knew. I wished for this. Not grandeur. Not redemption from the people who would never see me. Just a quiet life, filled with choices that were mine. A life where my presence wasn't a utility, but a gift. It was a Tuesday in late June when the first envelope arrived. Handwritten, no return address, but I knew that looping script anywhere. It was Nadine's. The ink bled slightly, like it had been written in haste or guilt or both. I held it for a long time before opening it, the way one might hold an heirloom discovered in the ashes of a house fire. Inside, a single page. Elise. I don't know where things went so wrong. I miss you. We all do. Dad isn't himself without you. Mom cries in the kitchen sometimes. Maybe you don't care, but I hope you'll come home. N. There was no apology. No acknowledgement of what had passed. Just a fishing line cast out, hoping I'd forget the weight of 15 years and take the bait. I folded the letter neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it into the back of my journal, not as an invitation, but as evidence. Proof that even in absence, I was still expected to fix things. That week, the messages came faster. Emails from my brother. Texts from numbers I didn't recognize. One simply read, "You've made your point." As if boundaries were a performance. As if pain were just an act for an audience they'd grown tired of watching. I changed my number again. Set my email to auto-filter names I'd once said I loved. It hurt more than I let on. Blocking out people who shared your blood feels like cutting off your own limbs until you remember they've been bruising you for years and calling it a hug. My therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Yara with silver rings on every finger, asked me once, if they begged you, really begged, would you go back? I thought about it. And then I answered no. Because it wasn't about begging. It was about changing. About owning what they'd done. About seeing me not just as a resource, but as a person. They didn't miss me. They missed what I did for them. There's a difference. That summer, I took a solo trip to the coast. A small seaside town, all driftwood fences and salt-worn cafes. I walked along the beach with no destination. I read novels without checking my phone. I laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in years when a wave caught me off guard and soaked my jeans to the knees. The sun kissed my skin. The ocean roared without apology. And for once, I wasn't a daughter or a sister or a financial safety net. I was just Elise. And that was enough. One evening near the end of the trip, I watched a mother and daughter building a sandcastle. The girl, maybe 7, kept asking for help, her tiny hands shaped like hope. The mother didn't sigh, didn't scold. She knelt beside her, smoothing the sand, showing her how to pack it firm. That, I thought, is what it's supposed to look like. Not duty. Not silence disguised as support. But presence. Real, messy, loving presence. And I knew then I hadn't left my family. I'd finally come home. The return home as in my new apartment, my new quiet, felt different after the ocean. Salt still clung to my skin, not just from the sea but from the shedding of old griefs. I'd left a piece of myself on that beach, buried under driftwood and forgiveness, and taken something back I didn't know I was missing. My voice. It was subtle at first. The way I stood taller in the mirror, or how I corrected a barista when she got my name wrong instead of letting it slide. The way I stopped starting emails with just checking in and ended phone calls without apologizing for taking up someone's time. It wasn't rebellion. It was return. Then, one rainy afternoon, a knock at my door changed everything. I wasn't expecting anyone. My world had been trimmed down to those who saw me, truly. A friend or two. My pottery teacher. The manager of the little bakery I frequented on Sundays. People who didn't carry the Parker last name like a crown of thorns. When I opened the door, Nadine stood there. Soaked, shaking slightly, and holding another letter in her hand. But it wasn't the rain that made her tremble. "Elise," she said, voice small. "I'm sorry." I stared at her. Not with hatred. Not with fury. But with the kind of calm that only comes from years of weathering storms alone. "I shouldn't have come," she added, eyes darting to the hallway. "But I needed to see you. Just once. To say it." I didn't invite her in. But I didn't close the door either. She held out the envelope. This one was thicker, more deliberate. Her handwriting no longer rushed. It was the kind of letter you write after everything else has failed. I took it. "I never saw it," she said. "Everything you did. Everything you gave. I was selfish. We all were. But you were the glue. And we didn't even know what we were holding together until you walked away." She stepped back. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I just wanted you to have this." And then she was gone. I didn't open the letter right away. It sat on my table like a relic. I lit a candle. Made tea. Let the silence ask its questions before I gave it any answers. When I did read it, I found pieces of Nadine I'd forgotten. Childhood scribbles of love. Regrets that sounded real. And a confession that struck something deep. When Dad said you never sacrificed, I nodded because it was easier than speaking. But you've always been the one who gave the most. I just didn't want to admit it because then I'd have to admit who I was. She ended the letter not with a plea, but with a promise. "I'm working on being better. Not for you. For me. But if one day you find room for me in your life again, I'll be here. No expectations. No demands. Just me." I cried then. Not because I wanted her back, but because for the first time, I saw someone from my past really trying to meet me where I was, not drag me back to who I had been. And that mattered. The door to my past didn't need to stay bolted shut. But it wouldn't be flung open either. It would remain cracked. Just enough for light to pass through. After Nadine's visit, I found myself standing more often at my windows, watching the city breathe. I'd never noticed how even in stillness, things moved, clouds drifting, shadows shifting, birds tracing invisible threads through the sky. Healing was like that. Quiet, gradual, constant. I didn't write back to her. Not yet. Not because I didn't care, but because for the first time in my life, I was learning to let time do its work without rushing to patch the cracks. And because forgiveness, I was realizing, didn't always mean reconnection. Sometimes it was just releasing the rope that had burned your hands for years. Work remained steady. My team was small but good-hearted, and they never once asked why I started smiling more during meetings or taking lunch breaks in the park. They just accepted me in whatever version I arrived, sometimes silent, sometimes laughing, sometimes lost in thought. One of those afternoons in the park, I brought my journal. Not the cost of things this time, but a fresh one with a linen cover the color of sand. I titled it, "What I'm Keeping." And on the first page, I wrote, "The mornings when I don't wake up dreading a phone call. The friends who show up without asking for proof of worth. My own voice soft but unyielding. The knowledge that love isn't a ledger. The peace of paying rent for a space that is mine, fully mine." It became a ritual. Each week, I added to the list. A new favorite pastry from the bakery. A compliment from a stranger. The sound of my own laughter at something silly on TV. And slowly, The weight of those 15 years began to shift. Not disappear, no, but transform. From burden to ballast. From chains to roots. One evening, I hosted dinner again. 3 guests. No fanfare. No forced conversations. Nora brought a fig tart. Andre played guitar while we sipped wine. The third guest was a woman I'd met at pottery, Amina, who had a laugh like thunder and stories from a dozen countries. It was small. Real. Mine. And in the middle of the meal, as Amina recounted a tale of nearly missing a train in Morocco, I realized something that made my breath catch. I wasn't waiting for anyone. Not for approval. Not for apology. Not for some overdue reckoning. I was here. Whole. Alive. Enough. Later that night, I read Nadine's letter again. It didn't sting anymore. It felt like a chapter from another book, one I had closed, but not torn out. And maybe one day, when the soil is ready and the air is soft, we'll meet again. 2 women who used to be sisters. No roles. No debts. Just people. Until then, I will keep what I've earned. Peace. Self-worth. And a life where guilt cannot grow. Autumn arrived like a gentle hush over the city, leaves curling into amber, winds sweeping clean the corners of memory. My windows stayed open longer. I wore sweaters that still smelled faintly of sea salt from that coastal trip, and I found myself unlearning things I never realized I'd been taught. Like how love should cost you everything, or that being useful was the same as being valued. I had worn those beliefs like a second skin for most of my life. It wasn't until they started peeling away that I saw the bruises underneath. One afternoon, while organizing a drawer, I found an old photo, Nadine and me, ages 12 and 16. She was leaning into me, our faces painted with cheap summer fair makeup, laughing at something only we remembered. It was before the weight of obligation had settled into my bones. Before being the strong one became a sentence rather than a virtue. I sat down on the floor with that photo in hand, and for the first time, I let myself mourn not just the girl I'd been, but the sister I had once believed Nadine could become. That, too, was a kind of healing. Mourning the possibility. That week, I returned to the pottery studio. I was working on a series of shallow bowls, each slightly uneven, ridged with the pressure of my fingers. They weren't perfect, but they were honest. One had a small crack near the base, a flaw I nearly scrapped it for. But Amina looked over my shoulder and said, "That's what makes it yours." I brought it home, used it for fruit the next morning. The crack didn't deepen. It held. So did I. Around that time, I began journaling again. Not lists this time, but stories. Memories I'd buried because they hurt too much or seemed too small to name. Like the day I'd come home from my first job with my first paycheck and bought groceries, only to be told I hadn't picked the right kind of milk. Or the birthday when I gave Mom a gift she said was too expensive, only to find it regifted to Nadine weeks later. I wrote them all. Not to reopen wounds, but to see the shape of what I'd endured, and to remind myself that I had survived. And that survival wasn't the whole story. There was joy too. The joy of a cup of coffee no one else poured. The joy of music playing in the background just because it made me smile. The joy of knowing, deep in my chest, that I would never again have to beg to be seen. Healing doesn't ask for an audience. It happens in the quiet places, in the morning sun on hardwood floors, in laughter that rises unbidden, in the crack of a bowl that still holds fruit. I was learning the art of unlearning, and in its place I was building something better. A self no longer shaped by debt, but by choice. It was a rainy Wednesday when the envelope came, thick paper, gold edging, my name embossed in elegant serif. An invitation. Instantly, my stomach tightened. I didn't need to open it to know. Family reunion. It had been nearly a year since that dinner, since the receipts, since my quiet exit. And yet, here it was, a summons dressed as celebration. I opened it anyway. Some wounds need to be seen clearly before they can be discarded. Inside was the usual, details of location, attire, RSVP date. The note scrawled at the bottom in Nadine's handwriting read, "It would mean a lot if you came. Things aren't the same without you." She didn't mean that they weren't the same because they had changed. She meant they weren't the same because I had. I left the envelope on the table and went for a walk. The city was quiet, puddles reflecting the soft halo of street lamps. I wandered through familiar streets and let the sound of rain on my umbrella soothe the fraying edge of memory. They wanted me back in the same role. The dependable one. The fixer. The quiet purse of cash and calm who never asked for anything but was expected to give everything. But I couldn't go back to pretending. Not anymore. Later, back home, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a response I would never send. Dear family, you miss me, but not the real me. You miss the version who paid your bills and swallowed her voice. The woman who nodded through insults and smiled through dismissals. But that woman no longer exists. You didn't invite her to that dinner. You summoned her, accused her, discarded her. And now that the silence has weight, you want the sound of her footsteps again. Not her presence, just the echo of it. I have built a life where I am not a transaction. Where I am seen not for what I give, but for who I am. So no, I won't be attending. Not out of anger, but out of love for the woman I've become, and the peace she now knows. Sincerely, Elise. I folded the letter and placed it in my unsent drawer where so many truths now rested. In its place, I RSVP'd silently, with stillness, with absence, with presence elsewhere. The reunion would go on as they always did. Stories would be told, likely exaggerated. Achievements listed. Someone would ask about me, and someone else would say, she's doing her own thing. Yes, I am. And that thing? Living. Not surviving. Not sacrificing. Living. And I wouldn't trade it for a single toast or table setting with my name on it. The reunion came and went without much ceremony from my end. I knew the date, marked it in my calendar not to attend, but to honor like a personal holiday. One that celebrated not an absence, but a boundary. Instead of walking into a room full of sideways glances and sugar-coated scorn, I walked along the river. Alone. Peacefully. Watching the current tug at leaves already tipped with October's fire. It was, in its own way, a ceremony too. That night, I didn't scroll social media, didn't check for photos or mentions. But in the quiet, I found myself imagining it anyway, Nadine making polite conversation, Dad commanding the room like always, Mom adjusting napkins and expectations. I could almost hear it. Where's Elise? And the answer, depending on who gave it, might have been a sigh, a shrug, or a scolding. But none of it mattered. Not really, because the woman they would describe in my absence was a ghost. And I was not a ghost anymore. I was real. Whole. Here. A few days later, a picture surfaced on a friend of a friend's feed. The family reunion table, everyone smiling. My chair conspicuously empty. A caption read, "Missed a few faces this year." It didn't sting. Not like it would have a year ago. Instead, I thought of the river. The sound of my own breath. The laughter I shared that night with Nora over takeout and tea. The way Andre strummed his guitar without asking for anything, just filling my space with music and ease. No one demanded I perform. No one questioned my silence. And no one called me selfish. In my journal, I wrote a line that surprised even me. Maybe the truest family is not who you're born to, but who doesn't make you disappear to be loved. I thought about sending it to Nadine, but I didn't, because some truths are for planting, not proving. Instead, I kept building this new life like a house made of small joys. I hung new art, rearranged my bookshelves, took a cooking class just because I wanted to make something with my hands that didn't require a receipt or an apology. At the class, I met Maya, a woman with a wide laugh and kind eyes who stirred sauces like she was coaxing secrets from them. We struck up conversation over a failed batch of homemade gnocchi and soon fell into the rhythm of new friendship. "Do you have siblings?" she asked one evening as we chopped basil and watched rain fall against the window. I hesitated, then said I did. It wasn't a lie. What I had now were memories, some tender, some sharp, and a path that no longer led to the door they closed behind me. There are ghosts in every past. But the miracle isn't their silence. It's that one day, they stopped knocking. BY November. The air sharpened with that peculiar chill that makes you reach for sweaters and memories all at once. I started lighting candles earlier in the evening, warming soups on the stove, filling my home with the scent of cumin and rosemary and things that reminded me I could nourish myself. The apartment, once a temporary refuge, had become a haven. Every object within it had meaning. The mismatched mugs I'd picked up from a thrift store. The record player that crackled jazz on quiet Sunday mornings. A hand-painted sign by the door that read, "You owe no one your silence." Then came the news. My father had a mild heart attack. It came not through family, but through an old coworker of his who still followed me on LinkedIn and had heard through the office grapevine. Thought you should know, the message read, in case no one told you. They hadn't. I stared at the message for a long while. Not out of panic, but out of that old reflex to respond, to show up, to abandon myself for the sake of the story they expected me to fill. But I didn't. I sat with it. I remembered the man who once told me I was selfish for not giving more, who only raised his voice when silence would have been kinder, who never thanked me for the rent I covered, the groceries I brought, the warmth I gave when his own words left the house cold. I didn't call. Not because I hated him, but because I had finally stopped hating myself enough to believe that my love needed proof. It was strange, this kind of detachment. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't vengeance. It was just freedom. Still, the dreams returned that week. Dreams where I sat at the family dinner table, everyone eating as if nothing had changed. Except I was invisible. I'd speak, and no one turned. I'd cry, and no one noticed. I'd leave, and the meal continued, uninterrupted. I'd wake with tears on my pillow. Not from sadness, but from the ache of having once wanted so badly to be heard. In therapy, I told Yara about the dreams. She asked, and in the dream, what would happen if you didn't leave? If you stood up and shouted? I shook my head. They'd still go on eating. Then maybe it's not your silence that made them not listen, she said gently. Maybe it's that they were never listening to begin with. And just like that, a weight I didn't even know I was still carrying cracked and fell away. I began writing again, not just journal entries, but essays. Reflections. Little vignettes of memory and growth. I posted one anonymously on a blog. It was about boundaries and leaving without burning. It went viral. Messages poured in from strangers who recognized themselves in my words. Thank you for making me feel seen. This is my mother. You gave me permission I didn't know I needed. And I wept. Because for all the years my voice had been diminished, somewhere in the world, it now echoed in hearts that beat like mine. I was building something now. Not for them. For me. A house of words. A home made of knowing. And in this place, I was not just welcome. I was free. Thanksgiving came, as it always did, wrapped in cinnamon and expectation. The streets filled with golden leaves and families piling into minivans with casseroles and folding chairs. At the grocery store, couples argued gently over stuffing mixes. Children whined for marshmallows. I walked the aisles alone, basket half full with vegetables and wine, and realized, this year, I wouldn't be going anywhere. No table to set. No chair to fill. No questions to deflect. No invisible duties to perform under the name of gratitude. I made a pie anyway. Not because anyone expected me to, but because I wanted to. I peeled the apples slow, watching them curl into soft spirals in the sink. I folded spices into the crust with my fingers. As I worked, music played softly, a playlist of women's voices. Fiona Apple. Tracy Chapman. Adele before the heartache hardened her. That night, I wrote a letter to my father. I didn't intend to send it. I needed it more than he ever would. Dad, you once called me selfish in front of the whole family. You said I never sacrificed anything, And no one corrected you, not even Nadine, who I'd paid rent for. Not even Mom, who I'd comforted through every silence you gave her. But here's what you didn't see. The unpaid bills I covered without a word. The vacations I skipped to make sure you kept your home. The birthdays I planned when no one remembered mine. The hours I worked, the nights I cried, the dreams I buried to keep our family stitched together with thread you never noticed. You didn't see because you didn't want to. You didn't listen because it was easier to call me cold than to face your own reflection. But I see me now, and I won't let your blindness become my mirror. So this Thanksgiving, I'm not at your table. I'm at mine. Small, quiet, honest. And I am giving thanks for leaving. For surviving. For no longer mistaking your approval for love. And though I won't send this letter, I needed to write it. Because I finally know what I'm worth. I folded the letter and slid it into the back of my journal. It sat alongside the others, the unsent, the unspoken, the unwelcome truths I no longer needed to scream aloud to be real. That night, I lit a candle, poured a glass of wine, and ate my dinner in silence. Not the silence of suppression. The silence of peace. I toasted the empty chair across from me. Not in mourning, but in release. December draped itself over the city like velvet, dark and soft, with pockets of light from shop windows and strings of blinking holiday lights. I used to dread this season. The obligations, the performative joy, the feigned warmth in rooms that always left me cold. This year was different. I bought a tree. Small, a little crooked, but real. I carried it up 2 flights of stairs myself and set it in the corner of the living room. It smelled of pine and possibility. I decorated it slowly, stringing lights while an old jazz record played. Each ornament I hung was chosen, not inherited, no family relics, no ghosts pretending to sparkle. The holidays were mine now, and that felt revolutionary. At work, invitations came in for secret Santas and potlucks, most of which I gently declined. Not out of bitterness, but protection. I was learning the difference between isolation and solitude, and choosing the latter with intention. On Christmas Eve, I made cocoa with a hint of cayenne, wrapped myself in a thick sweater, and reread my own words. The blog post that went viral had sparked something I didn't expect. Emails continued to arrive from strangers, daughters, sons, siblings, spouses. People who had lived years in silence and were now, finally, learning how to leave. One note stood out. You don't know me, but I want to thank you. I read your story to my therapist, and we cried together. For the first time, I understood that my pain wasn't weakness. It was survival. I replied simply, you are not alone. And you are not selfish for choosing yourself. The woman's name was Leah. Over the next few weeks, we exchanged more messages. Stories. Encouragement. It felt like lighting candles in a long, dark hallway. I realized that, without meaning to, I'd begun building community. Not with people I was born to, but with people who saw me without needing anything in return. And that was a kind of magic no family tree could grow. On New Year's Eve, I invited a few friends over, Maya, Amina, and 2 neighbors I'd grown close to. We made simple food, played music, danced barefoot in my tiny living room. At midnight, as fireworks bloomed in the sky and everyone counted down, I stood by the window. 10, 9, 8. I didn't make a resolution. I made a vow. To never again shrink myself for someone else's comfort. To never again confuse duty with devotion. To never again trade my peace for proximity. And as the clock struck midnight, I smiled, not because a new year had come, but because I had. January began with frost on the windows and clarity in my chest. The kind of clarity that only arrives after a long storm has passed, not loud or triumphant, but clean, like the silence that follows snow. It was during one of those quiet mornings, coffee in hand and feet tucked beneath me on the couch, that the letter arrived. This one came not from family, but from a lawyer. And estate matter, it said. I almost laughed. After all the years of being invisible, They were now reaching out because something needed dividing. I read it once, slowly, then again more quickly, and finally, I called the number listed. The estate was that of my maternal aunt, a woman I had seen only occasionally at holidays, who had once told me at age 10 that I asked too many questions for a girl. I remembered her perfume, thick and floral, her pearls clutched like she was warding off poverty. She had left me money, a considerable amount. The letter detailed the will, and the conditions were simple, except the inheritance, and with it, the public obligation of attending a formal reading and subsequent family luncheon. A performance. A charade. One final curtain call, where my attendants would quietly rewrite the story they told about me. Not the black sheep, not the one who walked away, but the obedient niece who came back when it mattered. I sat with it for days. The money would help, of course it would. But my peace had become something I no longer negotiated. So I declined. Formally. Respectfully. In my response, I wrote, I choose to remain at peace, even if it costs me comfort. I hope you understand. I don't know if they did. I don't think understanding was ever their currency. But for the first time in my life, I walked away from something that might have bought their approval and didn't feel the urge to run back for change. Instead, I invested in something different. I registered a domain, bought a cheap but serviceable template, and began transferring my anonymous writings to a personal site, my name finally printed at the top of each post. Elise writes. It felt terrifying. And right. I shared my first essay under my own name, a piece about learning to celebrate holidays alone without apology. It was raw, tender, and unapologetically mine. The responses were swift and affirming. Dozens of messages. Then hundreds. And then, one surprising message from a publishing imprint. A woman named Cora, an editor, who wrote, Your voice is rare. And necessary. Have you ever considered expanding your story into a book? I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I doubted my story, but because I had never imagined that choosing myself could lead to something so visible, so validating, so true. I wrote back, yes. I think I have a story worth telling. Because I do. And it begins not with a perfect family or a gracious inheritance, but with a woman who placed receipts on a table and finally walked away. The proposal began at the kitchen table, between spoonfuls of oatmeal and long sips of coffee. I wasn't trying to be profound. I just wrote what I knew, the ache of invisibility, the currency of sacrifice, the quiet breaking point that no one else seemed to notice until you were already gone. Cora guided me gently through the process. Her emails were thoughtful, her feedback precise. Let it be what it is, she said once, when I struggled to make a chapter sound more palatable. Messy is honest. Honest is power. So I didn't polish the pain. I let it bleed. Each chapter became a room I walked back into. The Christmas where I spent my entire bonus on gifts for people who forgot to buy me one. The afternoon Dad called me dramatic for asking why my name was left off the lease, even though I paid the rent. The birthday where I cooked my own dinner and still got scolded for not making enough mashed potatoes. And, of course, that night at the dinner table. The receipts. The silence. The final door closing. Writing it down didn't reopen wounds, it cleaned them. Some days, I cried at the keyboard. Other days, I laughed bitterly. A few times, I had to step away entirely, my breath caught in the past. But every time I returned, the words came clearer, like I was building a bridge not just for myself, but for others who had been made to feel like ghosts in their own homes. Maya read early drafts. So did Amina. They both cried. They both thanked me. You're writing the book I needed when I was 20, Maya said once, hugging me tightly. One afternoon, Cora called with news. A publisher had made an offer. They wanted the story as is. No sugarcoating. No softened edges. They saw the strength in the truth. And just like that, something inside me, something long silenced, stood taller. I called the manuscript the cost of staying quiet. It wasn't just my story. It was a ledger. A reckoning. A love letter to anyone who'd ever been told they were too much, or not enough, or only valuable when convenient. In the dedication, I wrote, "For the women who cooked dinners they never got to enjoy, who paid bills in silence, who gave love that was never returned with interest. This is for you. You are not selfish for leaving. You are not broken for choosing yourself. You are not alone." When I hit send on the final draft, I didn't cry. I smiled. Quietly. Proudly. Because I had written my way back to myself. And no one could take that away. It took 6 weeks from acceptance to announcement. Cora called me first to let me know the publisher's press release would go live that morning. I had prepared myself, or so I thought. I had told myself I was ready to be seen, to have my words out there attached to my name, no longer shielded by anonymity. But nothing prepared me for what it felt like when they found the book. Not the strangers, the readers who wrote me emails of gratitude, whose own stories poured into my inbox like a flood. That part felt like light. It was the call from an old family friend. "Your father saw the announcement," she said, her voice careful. "He's upset." Of course he was. A man like him, who'd built his whole identity on control and image, would feel threatened by truth, especially when it didn't orbit around his version of the story. I received the first message from Nadine 2 days later. A voice memo, because she knew I might not read a text. "I know you're telling your truth," she began. "But do you have to do it publicly? Do you know what this is doing to them? To us?" There was no acknowledgement of the years I had spent bending myself into silence. Just concern about the ripple effect of my freedom. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have words, but because I had already written them. They were printed on cream pages, bound in soft matte, sitting on pre-order shelves and in the hands of women like me. People kept asking, "Are you afraid of what your family will say?" No. Because for once, I wasn't waiting for their reaction. I wasn't hoping for understanding or forgiveness or praise. I wasn't hoping for anything at all from them. I had built something that didn't require their applause. And that, I realized, was the most terrifying thing of all for them. They couldn't control the story anymore. I could imagine my father's fury, pacing the living room. My mother's tight-lipped attempts to downplay the situation. "She's exaggerating," they might say. "That's not how it happened." They'd call it revisionist, emotional, dramatic. But what they couldn't call it was false. Because every word came from the life I had lived, the one they never bothered to see. Cora had warned me, when you speak your truth, especially when it threatens someone else's denial, they will try to make you feel small. But I had lived small. Now I was living free. The day the book was released, I went to the bookstore myself. I didn't tell anyone. I just walked in, browsed the shelves, and there it was, The Cost of Staying Quiet, nestled between memoirs of survival and transformation. I ran my fingers along the spine, not for proof, but reverence. Then I bought a copy, not for them, for me, because this was not just a story. It was the monument I built with the bricks they threw. The reviews came swiftly. Most were from readers who saw themselves in the lines, who underlined whole paragraphs and whispered, "Me too," into the pages. Some cried. Some shared. Some left notes in the margins, sent me photos, wrote letters that began with, "I thought I was the only one." Those were the ones I cherished. But not all the echoes were kind. An online forum popped up, started by someone connected to my family. It didn't take long to find its threads, anonymous posts, old photographs, vague attempts at character assassination dressed up as concern. "She's just bitter. She was always too sensitive. She's rewriting history." They didn't speak my name, but I recognized their cadence. It was the same tone that had followed me my whole life, like an undertow beneath every family gathering, dismissive, patronizing, rooted in fear. Still, I didn't reply, because silence is no longer submission. Sometimes it's armor. I forwarded the worst of it to Cora, who simply replied, "This means it's working. You're shaking something loose." Then came a voicemail from my mother. Her voice, weary, softer than I remembered. "I read the book. I didn't want to at first, but I did. I don't agree with everything, but I see how much I missed. I'm sorry I didn't protect you better. I don't know if you'll ever want to talk again, but I wanted you to hear that. I sat with her words like hot tea on my palms. Careful. Tentative. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was the first honest thing I'd heard from her in years. I didn't respond, not yet, but I didn't delete it either. Instead, I went outside. The air was warming, the first hints of spring curling at the edges of sidewalks and rooftops. I walked to the small park by my apartment and sat on the bench beneath the budding cherry tree. I watched people pass, mothers and sons, old couples, college students laughing with burritos in hand. And I felt it again, that sensation of breath, deep and clean. I was blooming too. Not for them. For me. And the beautiful thing about blooming, you don't need anyone to notice. You do it anyway. It was early April when I heard the knock. Not the hurried, anxious kind that delivers bad news. Not the timid tap of a neighbor asking to borrow sugar. This was soft, intentional, familiar in a way that pulled my breath back into my throat. I opened the door to find Nadine. She looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in presence, like someone who had finally realized the weight of her own shadow. Her eyes were cautious, but not defensive. In her hands, she held a copy of my book, dog-eared and worn. "I've read it," she said quietly. I said nothing at first. Just looked at her, really looked. She wore none of her usual armor. No practiced smile, no perfectly curated lines. Just a woman carrying the truth in her hands like it might break. "I came to say thank you," she added. I stepped aside, just enough. Not an invitation, but an opening. She entered carefully, glancing at the corners of my space like she was entering a temple built from someone else's grief. She sat. "I didn't understand back then," she said. "I think I didn't want to. Because if I did, I'd have to see myself in the reflection of your pain." I stayed quiet. There was nothing to fill. No gap to bridge. She continued. "Reading it was like watching a home movie of someone else's childhood and realizing you were in the background the whole time, but never noticed what they were carrying. I'm sorry. Not just for what I did, but for what I let happen." She wept then. And something inside me softened. Not the core, not the boundary, but the wall between presence and possibility. "I don't expect anything," she said, wiping her cheeks. "I just wanted you to know that I see you now. For real. We didn't hug. We didn't reminisce. But I offered her tea, and we sat. In silence. In honesty. In something that looked like the early scaffolding of grace. When she left, she placed the book gently back on my table. "I bought another copy," she said with a small smile. "This one's for you." After the door closed, I sat for a long time. Not unraveling. Not hoping. Just breathing. That evening I journaled. Sometimes the apology comes not in words, but in presence without expectation. And sometimes that's enough to begin. I didn't call it forgiveness. But I called it a beginning. Spring deepened, and so did I. With every warm breeze that slipped through my windows, I felt parts of myself returning not like guests, but like limbs I hadn't realized I'd been living without. It was a quiet, sacred resurrection. I started a garden on my balcony. Just a few pots at first: basil, lavender, thyme. Plants that responded to attention, but didn't demand it. I liked their stillness, the way they simply grew toward the light without apology. Nadine sent a card a few weeks after her visit. No phone call. No intrusion. Just a pale blue envelope and a line of ink that said, "I hope you're growing something beautiful." I smiled at the phrasing. Because I was. The book was doing well, far beyond anything I'd imagined. A second printing was already underway. There were discussions of a book tour, panels, interviews. My name was being spoken in spaces that once seemed untouchable. But more than that, I was being heard. At a reading in a small independent bookstore, a woman in her 70s stood up during the Q&A and said, "I spent my entire life as the quiet one. You gave me a voice I didn't know I was allowed to have. I cried with her afterward. Because we weren't alone. We had never been alone. We had just been told we were. And now? Now we were telling each other otherwise. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and saw the sunlight hitting my counter in just the right way, illuminating a small stack of pages beside the kettle, drafts of my second book. This one wasn't about the family I left. It was about the woman I became. I was writing her into the world like a promise. Later that day, I received a letter from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. She wrote, "I always envied you, the way you gave. I didn't realize how much it cost you. I'm sorry we let you pay the toll alone." I read it twice, and then placed it beside Nadine's. Not as keepsakes of pain, but markers of change. The garden flourished. I added tomatoes and rosemary, even a struggling fig tree that clung to life with the same stubbornness I once did. I tended to them in the early mornings, hands in the soil, breath steady. There was a time when I would have said I did everything for my family. Now, I did things for joy, for peace, for the woman who once stood up at a dinner table and walked away from everything that called itself love but never loved her back. And what I was growing now, it didn't need permission. It just needed sun, space, and truth. Summer tiptoed in with jasmine-sweet air and long, lingering twilights. I found myself lingering too on balconies, in bookstores, in the small moments of stillness that no longer felt like waiting, but like living. I was speaking more often now, at panels, retreats, workshops. I spoke about boundaries, about leaving, about the courage of saying enough without raising your voice. And at each event, someone always asked, "Have you forgiven them?" It was never asked with malice. Just curiosity, hope perhaps, that peace always ended in reunion. I answered honestly, "I've forgiven what I needed to free myself." But forgiveness doesn't always mean return. Sometimes it's just the letting go that lets us live. And each time, someone nodded a little too hard. Because they knew. Because they were holding that same jagged question in their own chest. Forgiveness is a room I visit, not a home I live in. It has no furniture, no key. Just a window cracked open where the air moves easily and the past can leave without slamming the door. In July, Nadine sent a photo. It was of a small studio she'd rented to paint in again. "I think I lost her for a while," the caption read. "But I'm starting to hear her voice again." I didn't respond right away. I let the message sit, like a cup of tea cooling on the table, still good, just waiting for the right moment. Later, I sent back a picture of my garden. The fig tree had finally borne fruit, small, delicate, brave. No words, just the photo. She responded with a heart. That was it. No apologies. No reaching back into the old wounds. Just a quiet nod across the distance, like two travelers who had finally met themselves on different paths. And perhaps that's what reconciliation really is. Not returning to what broke you, but acknowledging each other's repair. In therapy, Yara said, you don't have to climb back into the fire to prove you've healed from the burns. So I didn't. I stayed where the air was clean, where the light filtered gently, where the only thing expected of me was honesty. One afternoon, a reader approached me after a small book signing. She was younger, maybe mid-20s, trembling slightly. "I just left," she said. "My family, my home, everything." I looked into her eyes and saw myself. Not the broken version. The beginning. I handed her a copy of my next manuscript. Not yet published, but almost ready. "It's not about them," I said softly. "It's about you." She clutched it like lifeline. And I walked away, not proud or pious, but whole. Because I knew what it took to get here. Because I knew what it cost. Because I was the receipt no one could deny.